So, openness, why am I talking about it? Well, today, the UK is generally perceived to be one of the most transparent administrations in the world. We were the first to have an open data portal. If we just ignore the Americans, one with 10 data sets on it, we had 100 on ours, and it was 2 weeks later. We've legislated to release open data and improve our freedom of information laws. And we've mandated that everything is digital by default, and that everything has to be released in an open document format so that people don't have to have Microsoft or other proprietary software to understand what we're releasing and what we're doing. We're one of the core founding members of the Open Government Partnership, and we're currently running projects in about 28 different countries around the world through our foreign embassy network, working with civil society and governments to improve openness. But most importantly, our citizens are actually using open data every day, and they don't even realize that that's what they're doing. But we haven't always been like that. And to be fair, we did have an 800-year head start on citizen participation when we started with the Magna Carta in 1215, when a bunch of barons didn't really like what the king was doing, so they revolted effectively, and they told him what they wanted. And at the time he agreed and then ignored it all later on. So 400 years later, we had another stab at that as part of our revolution and mandated freedom of speech, and we got it a bit better that time. And by 1812, we actually had all the proceedings of Parliament, in both chambers, being recorded and printed and available for everybody to see. So we have had a bit of a head start on that historically. But more recently, we didn't actually have a freedom of information law in the UK until the year 2000, which is significantly later than a lot of European countries. And at the time we thought, oh, that's it, great. Prior to that, we'd had this informal code of practice where citizens could ask government for things, and government would generally provide it, but they didn't have to provide it. So we legislated. And as I say, we thought, great, that's us done. We don't need to do anything else. Government's accountable, we're sorted. And then, round about 2008, various different media stories started dripping out about different MPs and their expenses and what they were spending their money on and claiming back on expenses. And a particular one that springs to mind was the husband of the Home Secretary of the time, who had claimed for a porn film in a hotel where he'd been on his own overnight, and we all found out about that. And that caused a massive scandal. And eventually, all of the data around these things was released, and we found out that our MPs were claiming for second houses, they were building houses for their ducks, and cleaning out their moats around their moated dwellings. They had 3 or 4 televisions, and this was all being done on the expenses that they were claiming are for us. At the same time, we found out that we were losing and had lost an awful lot of records. And effectively, we deliberately lost some of these records, and these were fairly fundamental to people's citizenship claims and other ongoing disputes around what used to be our empire. And we were wasting a lot of public money. Government IT projects in the UK were considered a joke because they just went on and on and on. They spent billions of pounds, and everybody in the street could do them better. So it wasn't really great. So at that time as well, the internet, Web 2.0, was taking off as a technology. It was beginning to happen. And we thought, how can government use that better? So we set up a task force to sort of investigate that. And it was called the Power of Information Task Force. And in itself, it was quite revolutionary. We published the report, we asked people to comment on it, and we published the government's response to that. And we used new technology, a wiki of all things, to devise some of that. But the key thing about it was the 4 recommendations that the report came out with, which were open innovation, open information, open discussion, and open feedback. Open feedback was about citizens being able to say what they felt about their public services and sharing that and doing that in an open forum so everybody could see it. Open discussion was about people talking about what government was doing for them, having a say in the policies government was devising, and actually informing it more regularly than just every 4 or 5 years as part of the election process. Open innovation was about freeing government up to use new stuff, but the most significant one was open information. And the report recognized that people needed to have access to the information to inform all of those other areas of openness and to actually understand what was going on in the country and what they wanted and the priorities that government faced. And that new technology would make that a lot simpler, and that the basic currency for that would be data and open data. There had been, owing to the new technology, a growth in the desire for information. This graph shows the increase in freedom of information requests. In addition, FOI had been around about 8 or 9 years, and it had grown quite significantly in the number and volume of requests people were putting in. And government and public bodies were beginning to find that a bit of a strain, and it was becoming quite bureaucratic and difficult to manage. Data journalism was just emerging, and the UK was quite a seedbed for that. And as I say, we've had various scandals, and people wanted to know more about what was going on. So everybody had a smartphone by this point. Well, not quite everybody, but anybody who was anybody under 35 anyway, had a smartphone or an iPad. And the internet connectivity across the UK was getting better. We had 3G technology. People were beginning to use it. We needed to get there, and we needed to release data in a way that worked. So in 2009, the then Prime Minister asked a chap called Tim Berners-Lee, a Brit, if he would help us look at how we released government data in a more open format that people could use and build on. And his objectives for doing that really were about increasing transparency, but improving public services and using that transparency to do that, releasing the economic value of the data and information that government sits on and keeps to itself, and the social value that that can impact upon the way society runs and functions, and releasing some of the potential for the UK funds, UK skills development, and creating a new industry in the UK. So we started working. What did we do? Well, we asked people, what do you want to do with data? What would you do if you had any data? And they came back and said, we want to know where the public toilets are. Quite a good idea, actually, because there aren't that many public toilets in the UK, and you can't map them. So that was one idea. They also wanted to know about the schools they were sending their children to. We thought, well, this should be quite straightforward. We should be able to do this. The other thing that came back out of this competition was we want a copy of postcodes, which are the address files for everybody in the UK, and I'll come back to that later on, because that's been quite an interesting story. And then we got everybody in a room as well as this competition. We actually spent 2 days with a load of people in a room and asked them to show us what they would do if they had government data, so we could get an idea of what the challenges to them using that data would be, what kind of data would be valuable, what format it would be better for us to give them that data in. And they came up with this thing that was called a postcode paper, which was quite powerful, which gave, by every postcode of the UK, a list of the services in the region, how to access your doctor, what the crime statistics for your neighbourhood were, if you wanted an allotment, where your nearest play park was, and things like that. Quite a powerful idea. And on the back of that, we realised that we had to revise, if we wanted to release that data, the first thing we needed to do was to revise the licensing of government information. Because in the UK, until that point, every piece of information government held or owned was owned by the Queen under something called Crown copyright. And people were only allowed to reuse it or do something with it with Crown permission. So we needed to change that, so we did. And we built something called data.gov.uk, which at the time had 100 data sets on it. They weren't brilliant data sets, but the point was that we could show them and they were there. And we could use them. And people started to use them. And this is January 2009. some reason there was a crisis of the number of dentists in the UK, and you couldn't find one. So somebody built an app showing you where the dentists were. Somebody else built an app showing you where the number of people in the area had been served with antisocial behaviour notices. They weren't greatly useful, but there were people doing stuff with it. And it was limited by the kind of data we'd actually released. And we get into what was an election period for the UK, and so by that point we've had the financial crash. The UK is entering a period of austerity. It's a very predominant political theme, it's a very powerful theme, and the entire elections, basically how do we deal with what was the deficit at the time. In addition, politicians were very keen on improving the accountability of government, possibly because their parliamentary expenses, and they'd been hammered, but also because they saw it as a way of saving money and driving down costs. It was the first election that social media played a massive part in the UK. And as I had mentioned, we've already got smartphones everywhere, and they've got even more predominant. So we have this election on the 5th of May 2010, and eventually 6 days later we got the first UK coalition government on the 12th of May. And that's where we see the shift from the terminology in the UK from really about open data to transparency, and we start calling it more about transparency. So everything from that point becomes transparency. On about the 20th, well, I think it's probably the 19th of May, might be wrong, it's a bit hectic. The new Prime Minister, David Cameron, stood up and announced that he was completely committed to greater transparency in the UK, and it was going to drive improvements in public services, an information revolution, and it was going to change the way the economy ran. Now, there were lots of reasons why he was committed to it, but basically, ideologically, prior to the election, it had had cross-party support, and it was the right thing to do. But don't lose sight of the fact that it's a lot easier to cut people's public services if you've told them and you've shown them and you've shared with them where those resources are going and what you're spending them on, and asking them to help prioritise where those cuts can be made and what they don't need and what they do need. Makes it a lot more palatable and people feel a bit more involved. And we started to see something called what we've now called the Transparency Temple, where we release the open data, get data users using it and doing stuff with it and translating it for people. Citizens can consume that, and that can support accountability, can improve public services, and it can change and release its economic and social value. As part of his pre-election promises, within the first month of being elected, David Cameron made some very specific promises. I don't expect you to read all of these, because there's an awful lot of them, and it's very small font. But they were about how all of government would release specific types of information, and that included all spending information on a monthly basis. Everything that government or civil servants used a credit card to buy would be, and it was over £500, it would get released. The energy usage that people were using in government buildings, that was going to get released. Details of public contracts, that would be released by departments, no questions, it would just happen. Including what senior officials were getting paid, who they were, and who worked for them, and what they did, was also going to get released. And that particular one about individuals' pay and grades for senior civil servants was released within a month of making this commitment. It was quite a challenging objective, but we did it. In addition, every department, and there are 26 central government departments with various agencies and other bits underneath them, and then there was local government. Everybody, without question, should have an open data strategy. It should focus on the information that was already in the public domain and how you make that more usable, and you should be looking at what citizens also wanted in addition to that. We also had to commit to changing how we collected and managed some of our data in terms of data that was charged for. And an example is the weather. So at the time, we charged for the weather data. So you could look out the window and see it was raining, and you could guess it was going to rain in 10 minutes' time. But if you wanted the data that told you that, you had to pay for that. And we needed to look at how we collected that information and how we funded that before we could release it openly Another example is our mapping information, which was similarly challenging. We had to build a request mechanism that was out with or in parallel with the freedom of information request to allow data to go out and people to access that slightly more quickly. Because our FOI law has a 28-day turnaround time. And quite often you won't get what you ask for in those 28 days. You'll get an answer and an exemption as to why you can't get it, or you won't get what you're expecting. And so as part of it, we started to look at how we reformed those laws to make it better, basically. And we legislated eventually in 2012 to say any data that goes out as part of a freedom of information request has to go out in a reusable format. We defined what we would charge for and why we were charging for it. And we consolidated some of the stuff around licensing and reuse and the open government license that the UK now has. Great. Departments had to do this. Departments had to report quarterly on how they were delivering these open data commitments to Parliament. This is a snapshot. It's a very well-chosen snapshot from my perspective because it's the only period where the Foreign Office actually met all the commitments and hasn't got a red column, which matters to me. It shows I have done something since I got there. But also, we have to look for data that matter to citizens. To make this really work, that's an ongoing process, and it's an ongoing dialogue with citizens, and that's where civil society plays a part. It's not easy for government to do this releasing of data at all, and I think there has to be an understanding of both sides. And certainly in the UK, government has got data and it's got it on legacy systems. And so you can get, and this is from my experience, you can get quite fixated on releasing data in a technical format that's reusable and matters, and you spend a lot of energy doing that. And I did this with the aid data, which the UK is committed to publishing all of our aid data to the International Aid Transparency Initiative standards. And I had the information, and I was focusing on getting the data into the technical 4-star linked data format to do that, and in the timetable which we publicly committed to do it. And we did that, and we're on track. So around about May last year, I thought, yes, we've cracked this. We've got this data out. We've made the timetable. It's brilliant. It's out there. Everybody will think I've done a brilliant job. And everybody did think I'd done a reasonably okay job. Until 3 weeks later, when these are the front pages of the tabloids, and you realize, actually, all I've done is slightly cause a problem for the Foreign Office, because I didn't look at the content of that information, which I'd just taken off the systems, and it doesn't really explain what the Foreign Office is spending that money on, or why it's doing that, or why that's helping the UK in achieving its objectives. In fact, the story about fish and mating for a fish in Madagascar is about how the UK put some small amount of money into helping the Madagascans breed an endangered species of fish because there happened to be another one of that species in London Zoo, so we managed to make that breeding program work to protect that species ongoing, which is actually a very good news story. It didn't play well in the media, and as you can expect, the Foreign Office as an organisation did not like the fact that this is how it's portrayed because it feels it's damaged the reputation of the Foreign Office, and in some ways it has. It has not made it look good. And that's an example of how it's not easy for government to release this information. That's triggered us into a massive cultural change programme about thinking about what government puts on its systems and how it describes what it's doing. That's a big change for a lot of people. But what does it mean for citizens? Because it's a bit more interesting than what it means for government. You can now see in the UK who is government, what they get paid, who's moving where, who's moved from what senior job to the other senior job, or who's left. You can see how many people report to them and how that operates, and that's released every 6 months. You can also see who's paid more than the Prime Minister, and as I say, that was 172 people in May 2010. It's now down to about 40 people, and those 40 people are probably justifiably paid more than the Prime Minister out of the public purse. They have responsible jobs that are non-political, and that's probably more fair. I can see exactly where my taxes go. I can see whether they're going into healthcare, disability benefits, or I can see whether they're going into the schools, or more contentiously at the moment in the UK, I can see what's going into the EU. And which is a critical point. But I can also see the terms and conditions on which we spent that and the contracts we've signed up to do that. That's particularly powerful if I look at the technology sector. And at one point, in 2012, 80% of government IT spend was going to 6 suppliers. It's not great for small businesses. It wasn't allowing them into the marketplace. It also wasn't great for government because we were locked into very big long-term contracts, which were not value for money. So it wasn't really good all round. That's changed, and we can see how that's changed, and we can track that. We can see emerging trends societally in the UK. We can see that metal theft became a valuable commodity, and we can see why people were stealing it, and we can begin to tackle that and identify issues to prevent it. As an individual, I can see healthcare providers and their performance. I can see which hospital I'm happy for my family to go to, and which one I don't want them to go to. I can see that by type of procedure or care or specialist area. I can also see why my GP practice is better than the one down the road that I left and why I moved. I can make those decisions and make an informed choice about it. But also in the healthcare sector, because we've released this information and we've tracked and we've released publicly the mortality rates around heart surgery, we've been able to actually see why monitor the rates of different surgeons, but also different units. And we've been able to see that some units don't perform as well and identify why. And we've been able to close those units and move resources into better functioning units and therefore create better specialist areas and improve people's healthcare and actually prolong and save people's lives in some instances. I can also see exactly where crimes are and what's happening with them. So this is a map of an area in London, and I can see that in my area there's about 17 instances of crime in April 2016. This is last month, 2 months ago. I can drill into that and see that 3 of them were in my street. I can drill further into that and see what kind of offences they were in my street. I can also tell you that that's 3 more than there were last year in the same month. So I have questions about what crime provision I'm getting. I can also then see that this violent and sexual offence, I can see what's happening with that. I happen to know that that's when my neighbour got assaulted by a lady dropping her child off at the local school, and I can see that that's still being investigated, and I can follow that through and see what will happen with it, and whether it gets dropped or whether it gets pursued. Talking of the local school, I can look at the schools, and I can see that in my area there are 4 primary schools, and I can drill down and see exactly by Ofsted report, which is the school inspectorate, or language, or the diversity makeup of that, and all the statistics around that, and why I would make a particular choice, and which one I would prioritise to send my child to. Transport. Everybody in the UK now has some form of transport app on their smartphone, and that is entirely based on the data that the Transport Network has released. This example is about London, where Transport for London invested £1 million in releasing the data, real-time data for the network of where every bus was, every tube, every train, every tram, every boat. And they've also built some apps themselves. And we'll better build apps so that this data gets used. Well, they've stopped building apps because so many other people have built apps. But they've also tracked, and they've tracked, that the return on the investment for that £1 million back into the London economy is 58 million, so it's 58 to 1. And that's through people getting to work better, it's through improving the way the network works, it's through being able to understand which buses work best on which routes and how they make that more efficient, and the people standing at bus stops and how they get onto that network. And it solves problems when there's a major transport failure in particular areas and what the alternatives are. And people use that, and that's used every day by a lot of people. More recently, we've started to look at how we take this beyond government information and into the space of the private sector. As one of our particular things that we are concerned about in the UK is driving out corruption and how we solve some of those problems and tracking some of the money flows around the world. And to show our support for that, we've released all the company data for all our registered companies in the UK as open data. So I can drill into this, and I can see that this individual is the director of a company. It's actually director of, I think it's 28 companies. I can also see when their next set of accounts is supposed to be filed, and I can see what those accounts are if I want to. I can also see it was declared insolvent. What I can't see, unfortunately, well, actually I can see if I go back to the individual, is that he was declared bankrupt. So I can see that he's not actually a company I'd want to invest in or do business with. And I can't see he's been corrupt. What I can't see is that he's been convicted of fraud. But I could gather the information that he was not a great businessman from everything else that's there on Companies House. And that enables us to track money flows between different companies and identify shell companies. I mentioned aid transparency. It's linked to corruption, but it's not just about that. We're very keen that not just our citizens can see where that aid money is going, but the recipient countries can see where that aid money is going. And they can use that to inform their own budgeting and resources to improve the lives of people around the world. And this is an example of how Uganda have used that in terms of tracking what comes into their country and how that gets allocated. You can also see who owns what property, and this is something we're working on at the moment, is releasing our land registry data and who owns what in the UK and where they're based. I can look at all the geographical data that we're working to release. And this tells me, it's just a slide shot of historical sites, because it's something I'm particularly interested in, of all the conserved buildings, registered listed buildings, where the World Heritage sites in the UK are, where the battlefields in the UK are, and historical sites of interest are. I can do that for scientific interest, I can do that for anything. And I can download that and I can use it for what I want. We're releasing a lot more environmental information, and people can use that to build apps. Flooding is becoming a much more common occurrence in the UK recently. And so this app, which is actually built by the Red Cross, alerts people when there's an issue to different parts of the country, and you can monitor your friends and family, or you can see what's going to affect you. It's just another example. We've released a lot more environmental data around bee populations and water quality and all sorts of types of data. And people are using that, and they're building apps, and that's great. And citizens then take that on and they use it. And as I say, they use it without realizing it's coming from open data, and I think that's good. Travel industry use it. Industry is using it to inform the way it does business. It feeds into its information services, generates intelligence, and the travel industry use the FCO alerts to determine travel insurance premiums and various other levels of risk. And we're helping break down barriers around exclusion. So this is about new technology and open data being used to change traditional barriers to deaf people. There's this particular app, but breaking down some of those barriers. But it's not just about data. We're also talking to people. And it's now commonplace for government to blog about what it's doing. If you look at the Government Digital Service, they blog about what they're doing in the development of the government website, gov.uk. People can comment on policies, and they can engage. We have formal participation routes. We now have a petition site where somebody can start a petition, and if that gets 10,000 signatures or sign-ups, that will then spark a debate in Parliament, and it gets discussed at the highest level. So there are formal routes as well. What we're going to do next? We've done it all. We haven't done it all at all. We still need to stimulate more demand from citizens and businesses for data and how they use it, and we still need to work with public servants to get that out. We need to work on the quality of our data. It's an ongoing battle. We have issues with legacy systems and other areas. We have to work out, and we have been trying to work out very carefully, and again, technology keeps changing, and this keeps this live and real, some of the privacy issues around personal data and identifying individuals and how we manage that and anonymize the data we release and what that means. We're promoting the use of data, and we're spending a lot of time informing and promoting dialogue in the UK. And I think we're seeing real results in the way that the citizens become engaged much more in politics. We saw that with the Scottish referendum. We're beginning to see it now. So, to summarize, we've not got there. We still need to work on the quality and usability of that information. We are working on the cultural change and releasing that information, and we're educating the officials around it. where we're constantly battling a changing landscape. We constantly need to encourage people to use that and do innovative things with our data. But we know it's the right thing to do, and we're committed to doing it, because we do believe genuinely that openness is a powerful value that the UK is proud of, and that government should be all outside and no inside, as Woodrow Wilson said. So that's what we're doing, and I hope that gives you some ideas and inspiration for what the power of openness can be. Thank you.